Welcome to the All Things Endurance podcast. I'm your host, Rick Prince, and I'm excited to have on the podcast today Nicole Armbrust. She is a running coach, physical therapist, and she specializes in working with female runners in the masters category, sort of 30, 40, and over. So, Nicole, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Rick. I can't tell you how excited I am to be here.
Yeah, we're going to talk about a lot of good stuff today. So before we get into this, I should also say you're Boulder based. You're another one of these crazy Coloradoans out here. If you could tell us a little bit more about your background, how you got into coaching, maybe your background as a physical therapist, and then maybe even more specifically, how you sort of got this niche of working with female masters athletes.
Yeah. So thank you. And I appreciate the introduction. And it's an interesting story. Well, interesting to me, but and it's a little bit longer. So it's kind of like this trifecta, like you said. My background is physical therapy. I just became certified as a US coach this summer. And then I am also I'd say quasi competitive masters athlete as well. And so, interestingly enough, I used to hate running. Growing up, I
Hmm.
was a soccer player, and so,
Okay.
that was punishment. So, of course, running was not fun for me until I got to college, and there was no more soccer playing, and my wardrobe didn't fit because I went from, uh, loving soccer to loving parties.
Yeah.
So, decided it was time to make a change, and when I was at school and started this running and, you know, 1 lap at a time around the track, but then once I was in physical therapy school, one of my friends who was a high school cross country runner, she was talking about she was going to run a marathon. And I thought, how cool is that? I want to do that
Hmm.
someday. So I waited till I got out of physical therapy school. I was 26. I lived in Michigan at the time. And I thought, all right, the Detroit Marathon's close to home. So if I need the hospital, it's right there and I'll be all set. So
Okay.
it was fall and I did the marathon. I didn't have a coach. I didn't know what I was doing, all these different things. But then the following week I was at work as a PT and somebody said, well, how was the Rick, blah, blah, blah. And I told her and she says, well, did you know that you qualified for Boston? And I said, well, what does that mean?
Right. Boston,
No
what?
idea. I had no idea. And her
I
eyes
love
got
it.
about as big and they were just like, oh my God. So I she's like, well, you have to go. So the following April, that was 2001, I went, and that's when, as they say, I got the bug. Um,
Okay.
being in Boston and having the privilege to run that race, and as a marathon runner, it's my second marathon, but I knew then that there was something that clicked, and it really was. It was like magic, and to me, it felt like home. Um,
Hmm.
and obviously, with my hat and my, that is something that I feel it's very sacred. I feel it's a privilege to be there, and it's something that is really in my soul as far as being a runner. But on the flip side of that, so I kept running and kept running. Eventually moved to Arizona. Just, life takes you in different directions. I was out there and dabbled in triathlon a little bit because I was like, if I'm going to work with triathletes as a PT, I better know, I better be in the trenches.
Right.
And so the problem was I didn't like swimming. And
Okay.
that's a bad thing to do if you're going to get into triathlon. So I, subsequently had my first, open water swim slash panic attack. Made it
Mm,
through that, and triathlon was never my thing. I did it. I did one Ironman just to say that I did it, and I
yeah.
can, again, my thing is I want to be able to say that I'm in the trenches with my clients and say that I've done it. So I was running around. I had done, I don't know, it's probably somewhere around 20 marathons at that time, dabbled in triathlon. And then I really wanted to focus a little bit more on my professional work. So I had, at that time, I was still a clinical PT working, and at that time it was really corporate where I would see maybe 20, sometimes 25 patients a day,
Mm,
and it was a lot, but I knew I really liked when runners came in. So I had the privilege of being sent to a fellowship program by a guy. It was a 40-week fellowship program by a physical therapist named Gary Gray. And
oh yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
he's known as the father of function. And I was sent there in 2011, And I always say that my professional life, as soon as I walked in, went from black and white to color.
Hmm.
Never the same again. And I'm so grateful for it because Gary uses a word called gaposis, meaning when there's a gap in something, and everything that I had learned as a clinician, as a traditional physical therapist, involved looking at, that was the way that things were taught. And it was so opposite from what I learned at the Gray Institute, meaning that you look at clients, traditionally, you look at people on the table, and
Hmm.
that's where you examine them, things like that. But, when I went to the Gray Institute, Gary says, okay, well, runners, being specific, they're not on a table when they're running. So why don't we, take a look at them when they're doing their activity? And that's when I learned about chain reaction biomechanics and understanding more about proprioceptors and being able to figure out a whole new way of being able to help runners. And I thought, why aren't they teaching this in school? But
Right.
I feel blessed that I had kind of, the best of both worlds. And so it was with this knowledge. And at that time, it was probably around, 2011, where there wasn't a lot of running specific PTs out there yet.
Yeah.
We were still trying to catch up, and the numbers were so high for runners and injuries. I mean, it was, 80% of runners were getting injured. And as a runner, I'd see these runners and they're just devastated when we have injuries. And I thought there's got to be a better way. And so once I learned what I did at the Gray Institute, it all started to make more sense as far as putting the pieces together, getting to the root of the problem, and saying, instead of saying, oh, your knee hurts, let's just look at your knee.
Yeah.
um, and so as time went on and I still kept running and doing my thing, I would see clients, and I really just started to hone my craft and really started to work with runners. And when that happens, you get a reputation. Oh, go see
Yeah.
Nicole, go see Nicole. But then all of a sudden, I was still a clinical PT, but then I started a running program on top of it, and it was just too much. I ended up, luckily, losing my job, and then I started my own business.
Got it.
So,
Got it.
and that was in 2014, where I could really focus on working with runners and still keep up with my own, you know, running around as well.
Yeah.
And just with time and everything else, I ended up moving out to Massachusetts and still was running. And I remember people said to me, just wait till you turn 40. Just wait till you turn 40. And I was like, okay, what's going to happen? I turned 40 and nothing happened. But when I was, so I'm 50 now, I just turned 50 this year. When I turned 42, I remember telling somebody when I was training that my legs felt wooden.
Hmm.
I was like, I didn't know at that time what that meant. Because that was still, I will call that baby masters runner, right? So
Okay.
there's still bliss in early 40s. And then time went on, and I continued to specialize and see more and more runners. And as I got older, and I would start to see the same changes physiologically in the people I'm working with, as far as masters runners. And I thought, there's some different things happening here.
Yeah.
And then you asked about how I ended up specializing. Like I said, I'm 50 now. When I turned 48, all of a sudden the hot flashes started. And it was like, I was trying to train for Boston. I was like waking up 5, 6 times a night. Thought, how
Hmm.
am I, knowing that sleep is one of the most important things, how am I supposed to, to deal with this? So that started my pathway down understanding perimenopause, menopause, and it has been a journey for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's interesting what you were saying about earlier about, if you're going to be working with triathletes, for example, you want to at least have one under your belt. So you have that, that personal experience of it.
Mhm.
There's a lot more information now than there was before about, female physiology. It's still sort of an emerging field, I feel like, when it comes to athlete performance, with menopause and whatnot. But it's one thing for me to read a book about it and say, okay, I'm now an expert at it, versus someone else who reads the books but also was going through it or has gone through it. How important do you think it is, let's say for a female master's athlete, looking to hire a coach who's dealing with these issues, to work with someone who has gone through it, because I'm sure because it is such a nuanced thing, and it is so sort of emerging information when it comes to athletes, that you kind of do want someone that's going through it so they can be like, oh yeah, I know that happened to me. Or do you think that's pretty important?
I think you're spot on with that, Rick.
Uh,
And it was interesting. I was specializing with masters athletes just because I felt this, kindred spirits with the, being able to identify. But then when I went through this myself and all the frustrations, I mean, I can tell you the number one diagnosis that I see with women that are, in perimenopause or menopause, I say is the diagnosis is frustration because of
mm,
all the things that they've gone through and the resource, just lack of resources. And again, it's not a fault because the science is just starting
yeah,
and the resources are just starting. As a matter of fact, it's even similar for masters athletes,
yeah,
right? There's not
true.
a ton of science out there for elite masters athletes.
Yeah,
So it's even more sparse. And that's why, again, going through the trenches myself and, sharing my story with people and being able to, you know, um, point them in the right direction or give them the right information because not everybody's, the physicians, they didn't have this training when they went to
sure.
school. So
Yeah,
it's not a fault by any means. We're all just trying to figure it out. And
yeah.
some people, have just been able to, I think just going through it myself, it forced me to educate myself and learn a lot more so I can help more people that way.
Yeah. So sort of not to sort of tangent off that too much, but there
Yeah.
was sort of a tragic story that really highlights this. There was an orthopedic spinal surgeon named Ed Farrar, based out in Washington. He was been doing spinal surgery his entire life, avid cyclist, was riding to work one day to do surgery, hit by a car, paralyzed from the neck down. And what was so interesting about this, he said a quote after the accident happened. He said he was embarrassed by how little he knew about spinal injury until
Mm,
it happened to him, because he always saw things through the clinician side. Okay, I read this in a textbook, or this is how you do XYZ surgery. But now as a patient, it just wasn't something he considered really. And he said
yeah.
he used the word embarrassed, if I remember correctly. He was embarrassed by how little he knew. So while I don't think you always have to be, okay, I have to do, 20 Ironmans to coach an Ironman, or I don't have to be a 6 minute miler to coach a 6 minute miler. I think in certain cases, when you're talking about things like menopause and things like that, I do think it's important. So I applaud you for being aware of that and then kind of going that route in your practice.
Yeah, well, thank you. And it's interesting, and I have goosebumps with that story because you hear things about that all the time. That's another reason why I thought, oh, I'm good with triathlon with the cycling issues that
Yeah.
just happen. But I think it was Robin Roberts who said her mother told her, "Make your mess your message," and
Mm.
that's kind of how I feel about. I had a mess.
Yeah.
It wasn't just my physiology, it's mental health, which physical health, and then that turns into spiritual health, which is something I learned from the Gray Institute as well. So I'm definitely I've learned so much on that pathway, and that's where I just feel it's my responsibility now to share this with other women coaches, as many people who listen,
Yeah.
so we can just help more people that way.
Yeah. No, I love that. I love that. So as putting on the physical therapist hat, are there any common issues that you see amongst masters runners, specifically female masters runners versus quote unquote, say younger runners that aren't quite in the masters age bracket yet?
Sure. And it's such a great question, Rick. And one of the things that has been really uh, probably the number one most discussed topic right now for women has been whether or not to for the individual to have undergo hormone therapy.
Hmm.
And what I will say about this, I mean, full disclosure, I had to have the conversation. I had symptoms. I went and got medication because for me, it was something I wasn't willing to give up on my sleep. Being able to perform and things like that. I will say the number one thing is you have to have a conversation with your physician. And if she doesn't, go find another one who can have that conversation.
Hmm.
It's such an important piece. Um, you know, the research that was done back in the day, that was then and this is now, right?
Yeah.
So we've luckily done better. I will say that it's not for everybody. It is an individual thing. I think that's number one for women. Not everybody, desires to go down that route, but again, it's very individual. The other two top things that I would say for both men and women is obviously strength issues. Knowing that we lose muscle mass and the fast twitch fibers, so we lose our power. It's kind of like the power shutting down, right?
Yeah.
And then the second thing that has been really, I'm very nerdy, but something that's been super exciting to learn about just as fast as the menopause piece. As a matter of fact, I did a workshop for them is learning about the fascial system or
Mm.
the connective tissue.
Yeah.
And that is something that we're learning about. The studies are out, estrogen, and it's both men and women. As we get older, masters runners, more stiffness, more collagen deficits, the dehydration. So being able to train our bodies. So when we talk about strength training, that's the piece where I think that's about as broad when you say, oh, you got to do strength training.
Yeah.
That's,
Yeah.
it's pretty broad. And that's where I feel fortunate that, most of us want to do our running, right? The last thing we want to do is the strength training piece. But if we can find, not if, we can find a way to make it really specific to running and, maximize the things we're looking for. And then encompassing that with the fascial system, which is basically where the term, mobility is a big buzzword right now, right?
Yeah.
But mobility is basically being able to move all the way through, have the range of motion through a joint. And that's where, as masters athletes, we have to, and again, putting my PT hat back on, one of the things I have to check, is there a, wear and tear issue where somebody's got arthritis and we can't get as far? But that's where it's making sure that, we're looking at those things versus miles, because it's not about the mileage for the masters, it's the maintenance. That's a
Yeah.
lot of M's, but
Yeah.
it's really, really, I stand so firmly behind that. And it's interesting when we had the USCA conference and hearing Lawrence speak up on the, talking about runners and running. And I had the privilege of being able to discuss with him about the fascial system, and his eyes lit up. So I knew, that if we can take care of that system, which is something that we just haven't talked a whole lot about because we're learning more about it.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's something that, in the fitness world, it's there, but it's
Mhm,
almost more of just like a bullet point. There's
mhm.
now an awareness that it exists, but very few people are really, researching it and then applying that information on a daily basis in their practice. So yeah, I would completely agree with you on that one. Um, so you've already sort of noted some of these things, but what would, like strength training and whatnot, but what would you say are some of the most important considerations um, when working with masters runners, or even for the runners themselves? What are some of the most important considerations? As you noted, fast twitch typically kind of everything becomes a little more endurance based, a little less speed and quickness and, power and everything. So yeah, so what are some of the considerations that you as a coach look for, and also maybe athletes should be paying attention to as masters?
Yeah, I think really one of the things that I've always prided myself in is curiosity and just kind of thinking outside the box. Like, if there was a great way that to be doing this, we'd all be doing it, right? And I
Yeah,
think a lot of the stuff is still very traditional because it's habit. It's the things that we've learned. Any change to a habit, that's hard for people.
yeah,
But, you know, why we insist, time is our most valuable commodity, right? So if we can, teach people that there's, you know, um, I call it almost like value based exercise movements. I don't even
yeah,
like to use the word exercise because we say that we need to supplement that in addition to our training. And again, the number one thing that I learned from the Gray Institute when I'm, as a coach or as a PT is to listen to the individual. I think that's one of the things we get going in our head. Oh, they've got this coming on. I'm going to do A, B, and C, but I need to hear from them first
Yeah.
and understand where they're coming from, because a lot of times they'll tell me what they need. If I say, tell me a little bit about your mobility routine, and I get this, and I say, that's okay, because
Yeah.
that's our opportunity. I'm almost glad when they tell me they're not doing stuff, because for years runners were told to stretch, and a lot of the stretching was awful.
Yeah.
It's found that it doesn't work. Well, we're very smart. Why we're not going to do something that doesn't make sense to us and doesn't feel like running.
Yeah.
So now with some more of this fascial, the dynamic loading and things like that, it just people are noticing, oh, that feels better. And
Yeah.
so we're able to make a difference, using these techniques, including soft tissue work and all of that, to really work on restoring the fascial system, and getting the runners to try and offset those, like the fast twitch, incorporating jump training, power moves, things like that, and neurological things as well. So it just
Yeah.
kind of makes it more fun.
Yeah, for sure. So that sort of is a good segue into the next one. So I'm, in February, I'm going to be turning 50. And, it's
Woo!
one of these things where, and I think a lot of masters athletes are like this, right? Like they remember when they ran cross country in high school, or they used to be, this, and even though they know that that's not the reality now, there's still this mismatch of expectations. Like I should still be able to run a 5-minute mile or whatever. So I think that the masters athletes I've spoken to, including myself, every time I look at the speedometer when I go on a ride, I'm like, I'm slower now. um, so as a coach, for these, especially kind of that type A athlete, how do you tackle this subject, and what are some main things to work on? Obviously maybe like plyometrics and things, but like I'm assuming that's probably an interesting topic. Like, like when I was working as a personal trainer, it was like, why can't I bench press the same amount that I did in college? Well, you're now an investment banker who's 55 years old, who works 100 hours a week and has 4 kids. So maybe that has something to do with it, in addition to
Mhm.
physiology. But how do you approach that subject with your athletes when that, like, why aren't I, whatever, whatever, whatever?
It's such a great question, Rick. And so the first thing that I would say if you were say, if you said to me, why can't I hit that time frame? The first thing it's say, great, I'm so glad you asked. Do you need to hit that time frame?
Right.
Just turning back. Do we
It's a
need
great way.
to go there? And it really is. I love the conversation piece. This goes back to talking with your athlete, so it doesn't turn into this, this is what we're going to do, because sometimes it's not about grinding harder. It's maybe just saying, okay, let's talk about this, and help me understand where this is coming from,
Yeah.
right? Why do we need to go back there? Because eventually we all know, even though it makes me laugh when you hear about anti-aging,
Yeah.
it's going to happen. I
Yeah.
mean,
It's going to happen.
inevitably. So
Yeah.
welcome to the club.
Yeah.
So knowing that we need to, and as much as I'm joking around with you, having a conversation about acceptance
Yeah.
and flipping the script and saying, okay, we're not going to hit those times.
Yeah.
It's just like an Olympian, that's a thing when they hit the gold medal, and then all of a sudden they have this, well, now what do I do?
Yeah.
What if we focus on all the things that you can do and say, let's go after, if you haven't been doing your mobility, that's a huge opportunity to get faster. If you
Sure.
haven't been doing any strength, because most of us in our 20s didn't need to.
No, no.
So there are a lot of athletes that actually get stronger and and fitter later in life,
Yeah,
because
that's a good point.
we didn't have to do that stuff before.
Yeah.
You end up feeling better, and it's just like, then all of a sudden your brain just does this thing where it's like, I'm good with that. If I was working too hard, you can have a Ferrari engine, but if the outside of the body is falling apart and there's rust everywhere, it's those imbalances that really allow us to understand that, that was a whole lot of work. And it doesn't mean we can't be competitive, but not in that way. It just means, like I said, flipping the script and doing things differently. It's kind of like I use the car analogy. That's where Jumpstart Running came from. It's like we need to overhaul the engine
Yeah.
and the body of the whole thing. That's why we don't just, when we're taking care of our car and it's got 100,000 miles, we get new tires, the whole thing, and not just the engine.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe another way to, or a different way to ask that same question, how much of that, when let's say I come to you and be like, hey, look, Nicole, I
Mhm.
really want to still be running that 530 mile again. How much of that do you think is, for lack of a better word, ego driven? Not that like I'm this egotistical person, but rather I, I just need to hit these numbers again, just for my own ego to know that I can still do it.
Yeah.
Do you come across a lot of your athletes that are like that, or is that sort of just because I'm a complete psychopath?
To be honest, I mean, we're runners, right? And
Yeah.
that's one of the things I love about it. We're human beings and we're runners,
Yeah.
and nostalgia is a wonderful thing,
Yeah.
right? And so it comes down to, again, and this is, I am kind of fascinated by the psychology behind this. I would really dig into that deeper and
Yeah.
say, yes, maybe that's ego. So, asking the question, well, why is it? Tell me more about it. And I will be perfectly honest, as a competitive runner, I'm usually right there with somebody, and I will do
Yeah.
everything in my power. And unless I'd say, well, where are your split times? What have you been doing? Because sometimes it is possible.
Sure.
Depends.
Sure.
It really depends. And that's where I have to keep going back to, it is so individual. If somebody's taken some time off and haven't been, gunning their engine, maybe it is a possibility. So one of the things I make sure I don't discount it, and let's have the conversation. Let's see, the, where you've been, where you are, once I know those two things, then we can talk about where we're going to go after I watch you move, because
Yeah.
that's a whole
Yeah.
different thing. If you've been sitting at a desk for the last 10 years and want to run a 530 mile, might be a little more complicated. But
Yeah.
I think really just understanding the individual and getting to the psychology behind it, and seeing if it's a possibility, and then if it's not, then again, just saying, most people, if they want to try it, sometimes it's just kind of like, if people, let's face it, runners are going to do what runners are going to do, right?
Right. Yeah.
And I get that. And so then if somebody goes to do it and then they come back and we say, well, let's focus on longevity, because
Yeah.
most of us with time and experience and more miles say, you know what, I realize that I want to run for the rest of my life. And so it's kind of like this, let's have the funeral, bless those running times. And we say, let's just, the going is good now, I'm not injured, let's just focus on longevity and see what we can do moving forward.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you mentioned the psychology part, and it's so fascinating to me because, within our certification programs, even at the conferences, we have, sports psychologists
Mhm.
present, and it's always under the pretense, or for the most part, of sports performance, increasing sports performance, right? It's never about acceptance. It's never about, the psychology of, um, being frustrated that I can't hit those times I did. And I think for masters athletes, especially ones that were really competitive, I think
Mhm.
it's a thing. And I think, again, not that, oh, it's funny, when I was working as a trainer, all the trainers used to joke that they would have been better fit with a degree in psychology than physiology,
Mhm.
because of a lot of these things. And so I feel like it's something that coaches that work with masters athletes, again, you don't have to go out there and get the degree in psychology, but you have to maybe do a little bit of research on this because it's a thing, right?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think it's really important. And that's something else that, again, I credit my time with the Gray Institute, that really emphasized, they divided things up into three buckets: the physical bucket, which is, gravity, ground reaction force. There's, the biological buckets of joints and muscles, but the behavioral bucket,
Hmm.
which is where we talk about these things that we're discussing here, that Gary has said since. I think that's one of the most important things, and I would very much agree, because especially now that we are post pandemic, just mental health and getting to understand somebody and saying, help me understand where you're coming from.
Yeah.
And really being able to peel those layers of an onion and sit with your athlete and say, let's talk about this. Because otherwise, if you don't have that discussion, it's going to be this back and forth, and that never
Yeah.
works. So I
Yeah.
think really getting an understanding of, tell me more about this,
Yeah.
is so important.
Yeah. This goes back to something that, we had spoken of earlier about, you've done these, you've been in the trenches. One of the things I love about your website, one of the things on it, it says, I get you because I am you. Do you find that that message alone resonates with so many people and gets you, I don't want to say that that statement alone is what, has people come to you, but one of the things what we get from coaches or people that are especially newly coaches is how do I get clients? You know, and I think it's so important to identify as someone as something that people can be attracted to. They're like, oh, you get me because that's what I'm. Same thing. I mean, do you find that a lot of your athletes are like that's sort of that level that like, okay, this is the right coach for me?
Yeah, it's very much, from the beginning when I first started, I've been so blessed, like I said, that I say running chose me, because like I said, I used to, have this love-hate relationship with it, mostly hate. But then with time, I just became to, fall in love, and it has become something in my soul. And when runners from the very beginnings, oh, you're a runner too? Like there is something about that, again, that goes to the, I see you.
Yeah,
I see you, and you're gonna, you hear me because you know what it's like to go out there as a runner and do this. Whereas unfortunately, and it's gotten much better, but when, runners go to the doctor and they are with somebody who doesn't speak runner,
yeah,
nightmare,
yeah.
so being able, and it's interesting you said that, Rick, because you brought this up. That's one of the reasons why I decided to do the coaching certification, was because I had so many runners that were training for races, and they had these training plans, but they didn't know how to take care of their body. And so
Oh, interesting.
so excited to do this race, and now with hotels and the cost and the time and everything else, and then to have an injury sideline them,
Yeah,
thought, well, maybe I can help and jump in and understand training plans, because they did not teach that in physical therapy school. So you guys
yeah.
did an excellent job with the program, so that I felt like that was the missing piece for me as
Mm.
the runner, as a PT, and now as a coach, that I can speak all those languages now.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly I always love it when, a coach is also whatever, also a physical therapist, also a dietitian, also because
Yeah.
it's just brings out another perspective to that coaching practice. So going back to the menopause thing, so for any of our listeners right now who are going through menopause or they're trying to find a running coach or whatnot, let's say someone lives in Florida, they don't have access to you. Well, maybe they
Right.
do online, of course. But what would be your tips to someone who's looking for guidance to help them out with their running or any type of sport performance that are going through menopause? What are some things that you might be able to bring some clarity to?
Yeah, that happens a lot. I can't tell you how often I'm listening to podcasts and somebody says, "Well, there's not a doctor in my area that's trained, to help individuals with perimenopause." Fortunately, we are seeing more and more physicians that are becoming, educated with this, and they're, one of the things, the pandemic brought many things, but the virtual component. Um, there is an endocrinologist I work with. I sought her out myself,
Hmm.
Dr. Carla DiGirolamo. She's down in Florida. So, side note, I would definitely recommend to women not only find a physician who is well versed and can have the discussion regarding menopause, an endocrinologist, which is why I ended up finding Dr. Carla, because I knew something was off. This is men and women. When you become masters, it's so important to make sure that these, we talk about data points with our watches and speed, but data points for your health, blood work, your hormone, all of those things. we have to make sure that we're keeping tabs on them. So finding an endocrinologist that could have the conversation with me, you know, there's even places now, many people have heard of Inside Tracker,
Yeah,
that it's a place that if you don't have something local to you that can help you with their blood work, because I hear that from women all the time, that one of the things I tell them, they don't know about iron or ferritin levels that are limiting, that could possibly limit their performance. And this,
sure.
my doctor doesn't know. Well, and that's where educating them to, you know, to look for those things. So knowing that there, if there's not somebody directly available, there are places now online, more and more physicians, um, that are becoming, you know, able to do virtual, not it, they have to be licensed to, in order to prescribe, but more and
Sure.
more of them are doing that so we can have more conversations.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting too, to your point about Inside Tracker, I feel like because of the lack of knowledge of some physicians about certain things or certain niches like like human sports performance,
Yeah.
I found that there's a lot more of these platforms, whether it be, blood, stuff to screen for cancer potentially. It's really interesting that a lot of people are taking there are more businesses, I should say, that appreciate that people are taking their own health into their own hands,
Yeah.
doing and taking these steps, and then maybe seeking out a physician for to interpret the results. But taking that first step, and again, obviously, the fact that there's so many of these businesses shows you how many people are really trying to take charge of their health, whether it be for menopausal issues or pre-screening for cancer or whatnot.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why I said that I feel very passionately about putting myself out there more to be a resource for, you know, all of these languages that I speak, to at least be able to help somebody, guide somebody and say, oh, you need this. Let's take you over to this person there.
Yeah,
You know, because so many people are, like you said, trying to take care of their health, and the frustration when, you know, having to see 4 or 5 different physicians. And again, it's not their fault. It's just that's just not where their training or specialty is. You know,
right.
fortunately, there's more specializations now than there ever have been before. So
Yeah,
it's being able to, you know, find those people and guide people in the right direction and say,
yeah,
here, I got you. You know, making more connections within the healthcare community for the people that are, you know, it's sad to say, but it's almost like you need a healthcare advocate when you go to your
yeah.
appointments now.
You
And
do.
I just last week offered to go to a physician appointment with somebody, one of my athletes here, just because it was so disappointing. It was actually 2 women in 1 week who, the encounter that they had with their physician was just so disappointing and potentially damaging to their health.
Oh,
So
wow.
when I hear stuff like that, especially because I like I said, I take runners, I take it so seriously because I that's me. And if somebody sent me out to run on a knee with a partial ACL tear, that they said, "Oh, you just have arthritis." No, that's not okay, you
Yeah,
know? And so it's just being you know, frightening. But there's, on the flip side of that, there's really great stories out there too.
sure,
So
sure.
I would say to any individual, male or be patient and keep fighting.
Yeah,
You know, because the right one, you know, I guess it's kind of like dating. The right ones are out there somewhere, right? Sometimes
yeah.
it's a little bit, but we'll get there.
Yeah, and that's a great point too about the advocate being an advocate because as we know, no system works in isolation. Everything is, in some way, shape, or form connected and correlated. So it's great that you're doing that you're able to be an advocate and help connect the dots and help connect, these different systems so people have an understanding and have some direction to go. It's unfortunate that, you can't clone yourself a billion times and do this for everybody, but so be it.
Yeah, well, and I think what you have and what you've created with this platform for the coaches is, you know, you have done, and the rest of the gang and Cindy and have just, there's no ego. It is very much education based. We are all here. That's very much what I felt just even coming into this, that we're here to serve our, you know, the running community. And if I have a question, I have no qualms about putting it in the Facebook group or asking for somebody else's expertise. And that's what you have created within this group, which I'm so fortunate because, you know, I'm still figuring out, do I need to send somebody, 2 weeks for a taper for the marathon? Who's had more experience with that? For me being the rookie coach, but I think being able to ask one another and let's share so we can, the overall goal is to keep people healthier.
Yeah, yeah, I completely agree. I appreciate the kind words, and it's interesting you said that, and not as a plug of the certifications. And I just want to kind of put this out generally speaking, but a lot of the feedback we get are from coaches are, yeah, look, I learned a lot in your certifications, they were great, whatever. But the real value is that coaching group where they now know, there's what 15 or 1600 coaches in there that they can ask a question and they'll get all this really great feedback. I mean, I learned so much from that, from that group. So I think for people, and the whole point of that is right is to find a group like that, whether it be the USCA group or some forum where it's not ego based, it's
Right.
not people spouting their, you know, trying to sell something, it's
Hmm.
genuine good information. I think that type of platform is so valuable because you learn so much from it. Like I said, I read these questions that come in. I usually don't respond because it's like usually over my pay grade, but I'm like, wow, that's pretty cool. I didn't know that. Like, yeah, like they didn't teach that to me in
Right.
kinesiology school. So yeah, I think it's great. And I think it's always that constant journey of learning, especially with these areas that are sort of emerging when it comes to the real research on things or
Right.
so.
Right. And that's, when I had done, spoken to, a group about this fascia workshop and the menopause group, and she asked a question and I had to say we don't know yet because they're
Yeah.
still, I mean, it's so new, they don't have the research, it's not
Yeah.
there yet, but at least we know who to follow now, at least
Yes.
we know what it is and we know who to follow. Like, I'm such a dork, like I'm thrilled I found out the fascial research society is going to have a US like conference at, in August of next year. And I thought that's great because what started out as such a research based, like very clinical and things like that. But now they're recognizing that people are training and coaches and they're inviting everybody to come, kind of like what we were talking about. Let's figure this out so we can serve, more of our clients and our athletes and, get people feeling better.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. Yeah, it's definitely a group effort.
Mhm.
Definitely a group effort. Well, Nicole, thank you so much for coming on this podcast. This has been amazing. I think what you're doing is so great. And I just want to say too, in these podcasts that I do, in the people that I do, I've noticed that you've used the word serve many times. And I would say one of the things that I'm most grateful for, especially with this podcast, that I have the opportunity to speak to so many amazing people like yourself. And I just want to state that some of the most amazing people I've talked to use the word serve. They don't use client, they don't use, coach, they use the word serve. And I think it really sets a tone for the approach that you take to it and the approach that these other people take to it. So thank you so much for being such an advocate for the sport and for your athletes. Um,
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, Rick, because that's something that I learned again, like I said, the Gray Institute changed my life. That's when we first started talking about service. And, as much as the running around and everything else that I've done, I feel like so grateful for what the sport has given me that it just feels like now is my turn. I'll still be running around, still got goals, but I am now in service to runners, coaches, and that's where it just seems fitting to just give back. And I appreciate the culture that you've created within this group for that.
Oh, thank you. No, I appreciate that. So for our listeners, as you can see from Nicole's shirt, Jumpstart Running, and then jumpstartrunning.com is her website. And Nicole, so if people have questions about, even if they don't want to be a quote unquote athlete that might need a little bit direction, like, hey, I'm going through menopause or whatever, would it be okay if they reach out to you through your website?
Absolutely. And the first
Okay.
thing I would say is God bless you because you're
Okay.
going to need it. It's, and I'm more than happy to help. So
Okay, awesome. And for those on our the YouTube, the Zoom version of this, we'll also have your website on the outro as well. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Nicole. This has been great. Hopefully, we can chat again in the future about maybe another topic, or again, as more research comes out, we can stay on the same topic and dig even a little bit deeper.
I would love that, Rick. There's always something to talk about, and it's amazing how fast time goes by. So thank you
It
very much. That was super
it
fun.
great. Thanks a lot, Nicole.
Okay, you're welcome.